Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's so nice to see your smiling faces on this, the third day of the Social Outcomes Conference. I'm so glad you could join us for Impact Alchemy, turning data into decisions and decisions into outcomes. It is the first session of the day, so I'll just start by setting some of the norms for Zoom that will go for this session, as well as the ones that will all sort of be joining later on in the day. And I just want to lay these ground rules out before we get into the session proper. The first one is to mute yourself unless you're speaking, but keep your camera on if you're able. Make sure that we can see your name and organization in Zoom by renaming yourself in the participant list in case it's coming up like iPhone 4. Introduce yourself in the Zoom chat. It'd be great to know who's in the room and who's joining us. You can also share your thoughts and questions throughout all sessions in the Zoom chat. Do stay online for the informal networking sessions that'll happen after we finish here. Please check out the recordings of all of the sessions from the conference on the GoLabs website. And that link with the pink arrows going towards it is your sort of star for the North Conference, or it's the North Star for the conference rather. So if you go to the program, that will include timings, logins, etc. You can find all of it there. We'll also drop that program link into the chat. So what are we doing here today? What's this session about? As you'll have seen from that program, we're talking about data standardization and data-driven reform efforts in the public, not-for-profit, and impact investing spaces. And we're trying to understand how these efforts have brought the importance of measuring impact to the fore. We'll touch on challenges and opportunities of embedding information into decisions that improve results, and we'll highlight links between data and decision-making and the still important managerial, organizational, and contextual considerations for those using data to pursue outcomes. So I'll be the first to admit that the title of the session is sort of equal parts optimism and critique, right? So there's this elusive art of alchemy, as far as I'm aware, unrealized promise of turning base metals into gold. And I guess I just wonder, in a poetic sense, is that so far away from the ethos around data-driven reform, this idea of transmuting raw data into insights, which then in turn improve our decisions and ultimately improve the outcomes we're also desperately seeking. We're captivated, right, by this promise of using data for continual improvement and accountability, but we're maybe constantly or regularly disappointed by data-driven reform efforts and constantly experimenting and trying to make them work. So I know that we've flirted with some similar themes elsewhere in this conference, but I wanted to offer just a bit more framing and how we might orient ourselves to the session and discussion we'll be hearing today. So I'll be pulling a mix of what I've heard from other sessions and then also some of my own reflections. When you talk about data-driven reform, I think one of the first things to flag is that many of us come to this table with a bit of baggage. And by that, I mean we have all experienced the frustrations, the failures, and the feelings associated with deciding what data to collect and then trying to collect it, finding and cleaning and merging different data, prioritizing what data to listen to as we struggle to make decisions about personnel and budgets and service improvements. We work really hard interpreting data for a report, even when we know no one's going to read it anyway. We stress over what data to put into bid applications for grants and contracts that we really desperately need. And it's hard to know what data reflects the truth about applicants as we adjudicate bids, to pick suppliers, and sometimes we even really dread when we know that data can be used to control us or even defame us and our organizations. And it might just be me who has a lot of feelings here, but my point is that embedded in all of these seemingly mundane or technical tasks is the promise of sense-making and improvement at the risk of administrative burden and control-seeking behavior. We have strong reactions to data because its presence and use isn't so neutral. It can be our best weapon, or it can be a weapon against us. So That brings me to my second point, right? There's this tension for organizations and individuals between data being used for internal learning and data used for external accountability. And this is something that came up in yesterday's mix and match comparing means and motive session. And that internal learning part, and I want to say this as a public management scholar, is this true hope of performance management doctrine. And one of its key mechanisms is that we use information and decision-making for improvement, something that we refer to as purposeful use. But we know that very often these internal learning processes become subservient to the demands of external accountability, the monitoring and reporting requirements that we put on organizations as maybe funders or regulators or boards. So this brings me to my third framing point and my last framing point, that the function of an organization, alone or in partnership, really influences the kinds of decisions that they make and the data that they collect. This is something that I imagine Elnur Ibrahim will speak a bit more eloquently about tomorrow. But in this conference, we spend a lot of time talking about nuanced differences between having a charitable provider or a private one, a social investor rather than a commercial one, or the differences between projects across policy contexts and local contexts. And with good reason, it is important to talk about these things. But for today's session, as audience members, I want you to consider taking a lens on this conversation, which allows you to search for commonalities and appreciate differences, as opposed to wanting there to be a single answer to complex questions. Absolutely, the data of a provider of children's services, what they collect and use is going to be different than the provider of a social prescribing service. But at an abstract level, if we think critically about it, those systems might not be so far apart. So why am I telling you all of this? The reason I say this is because we're picking up on some of these themes with our four brilliant panelists, but they'll really be speaking in reference to their own professional experiences and organizational perspectives. And this means that we may, as a group, have to think slightly more abstractly about the promises, challenges, and opportunities of data-driven reform efforts that our panel discusses today. And so your challenge is to uncover and think critically about unlikely similarities and substantive differences in your own professional backgrounds and organizations. So as we hear from panelists, I want you to think and ask yourself, what kind of decision is being taken here? What are they describing? Are they talking about an investment to expand a program? Are they thinking about an offering of a different kind of maybe professional training? Are they thinking about shifting resources and budget? What's the decision that needs to be informed? Another thing to think through is, are we talking about data use for internal improvement or external accountability? And then also think about what's the organizational function that this applies to? Are we talking about an organization needing data that sort of offers a service or a product? Are we talking about an organization that does advocacy or coalition work? Are we talking about a purchasing entity that invests in goods or services? Really keep in mind these sorts of things as we begin to unpack some of the challenges associated with data-driven reform. So in a moment, I'll be letting our panelists introduce themselves with sort of a lot more time. But with us today, I just wanted to say that we have Gail Gibbons, who's the CEO of Sheffield Futures. We have Olivia Prentice, the COO and head of content for the Impact Management Project. Sarah Henry, the Director of Methods, Data and Research at the Office of National Statistics, and Patty Carter, who's the Director of Development, Impact Research and Policy at the CDC Group. So with that, let's crack on to the meat of this session. So for the next hour or so, I have the pleasure of launching questions and facilitating some discussion amongst our panel. And while this is happening, I would love for you to be feeding into the Zoom chat. It'd be great to know how you would answer similar questions that are being put to panelists. We want to know and hear what's resonating with you, what you think we're leaving out or getting wrong. And most of all, we want to know what your questions are, whether they be clarifying, follow-on, or substantive. All of those things go into the chat starting now. So don't be shy. After the hour or so is up of panel discussion, we'll open things up a bit more for question and answer. We'll fold things in from the chat. And if it feels right and time allows, we may open things up to hear from some of you all directly. So our conversation is structured across 4 overarching questions today. I've asked our panelists to answer, what does a future informed by data look like for you and your organization? What have efforts to realize that data-driven future look like so far? What challenges and opportunities are inherent to data-driven reform? And can data really solve all of our problems? So you'll notice that the arc for this session is that we open with a bit of visioning work, charting where it is that people want to go. We'll follow this with a bit more detail about how it is that they've endeavored to get there so far. After that, we will try to get a better understanding of what they've learned from their efforts. And finally, we'll ask a rather philosophical question. Is data really the key to solving many of our organizational and social problems? Or said slightly differently, do we need to recalibrate our expectations of what data and data use can do to improve social problems? So at this point, I'll ask Andrea to pull up some of our introductory slides, and I'll run through our panelists so they can tell you who they are, who their organization is, and how they would like to be using data. So I'll come to Gail first, followed by Olivia, then Sarah, and then Patty. So Gail, can you tell us a bit about yourself, about Sheffield Futures, and paint a bit of a picture for us? What does a future informed by data look like for you and your organization? And what kinds of problems would it help you address?
Good afternoon, everybody. And first, before I start, I just want to say, Claire, that was a fantastic introduction. Hopefully this will be a really engaging session for everybody, where we're being encouraged to stretch our thinking around this really interesting and important subject. My name's Gail Gibbons. I'm the Chief Exec of Sheffield Futures. I'm also a Fellow of Practice this year at the Go Lab, which is a great honour for me. Sheffield Futures is a large young people's charity based in Sheffield. For those who don't know the UK so well, Sheffield is a large city in the north of England. I believe we're now the 6th largest city. At one point we're the 4th largest city, but we're slipping down the size ranks. But a large city, and we work with young people predominantly between the ages of 13 and 25. On a whole range of issues. So, for example, we deliver careers guidance, we deliver youth work. At the moment, we run the child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation services for Sheffield. We deliver mental health programmes, youth involvement programmes, and particularly important for this agenda, we are in the middle of delivering our 2nd social impact bond. Our first social impact bond was a youth engagement fund, DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, funded programme that was specifically for young people aged 13 to 17 who were at risk of not being employed or in education. And we're now delivering another social impact bond, which is funded through the Social Care Innovation Fund, which is specifically about care leavers into training and employment. So as an organisation, we deliver a whole range of contracts, grants, traditional PBR projects, and also obviously the 2 social impact bonds. So next slide, please. So for my introduction, I've been asked to think for the future, think outside the box, and what would a perfect future vision for data in terms of data look like for me as a provider of a large charity. So firstly, I would love to have a single MI system. I'd love to have a single data set where we're able to measure impact across our whole range of different projects and services. Unfortunately, that isn't the case in most circumstances. So at any one time, Sheffield Futures may have between 20 or 30 different funding streams. All of those commissioners request different data sets. Some of those are useful, some are not so useful. And really, the provider or the charity, the deliverer, has little control really in terms of what is collated, what data is collated. There's little opportunity to input into what's collected. Sometimes there's a bit of flexibility at the beginning of the programme, but often not so much. So for myself, who has a huge ambition, and as a charity we've got a huge ambition to demonstrate our impact, having a single system where we could collate a whole range of really useful data about young people and how our services impact young people and how we can learn from that would be incredibly useful. The second thing that I would really want in my vision really relates to service users. I feel that service users are often left out of the equation for any project, whether it's a social impact bond or any other. And from our experience as a provider of services, we know that in order to achieve behaviour change, meaningful behaviour change, that the end user has to be absolutely involved in the process from the very beginning. So we know, of course, from our own experience, that if we want to make any personal changes, whether it's giving up smoking or whether it's doing more exercise, it will not happen unless we actually want it to happen. And secondly, it won't happen unless we have a set of ideas about how we're going to make that happen, and that's got to fit in with our existing lifestyle and habits. So it's exactly the same way with our beneficiaries. Service users, I believe, particularly for data, should be involved in what is measured, what is meaningful to them, how is it measured, what targets do they want to achieve, with some moderation, of course, from both commissioners and providers, but to be really part of that driving seat right at the beginning in terms of a data-driven future. And last but not least, my vision for the future in terms of data is a flexible data management system. We really believe that if something no longer makes sense, change it. And actually, social impact bonds have allowed us to do that to a large extent, and that's been one of the real benefits of being a delivery partner for social impact bonds, because we found that we're, as a charity, we're quite innovative. We're often changing if something doesn't work, and when we look at what does work, and we found our investors are very like-minded, that they're also up for changing things. But so often data management systems are quite rigid. There's not much room for change. And sometimes that does mean that we are measuring things that don't necessarily make sense anymore. So that would be my final point of a data-driven future. Can we have a flexible system, please, that makes sense, whilst understanding that we need to avoid gaming, etc.
Love that. So a single set of information that helps you demonstrate your impact, and that is easy to change as your methods change. All right, that's a feature I can get behind. So now I'd like to send things over to you, Olivia. Who are you? What's the Impact Management Project? And what does your future look like?
My future look like? Wow, that's a big question for a Thursday morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Olivia Prentice. I'm COO and Head of Content at the IMP. It's actually wonderful to be joining you all from New York this morning without having to get on a plane. So thank you to the Government Outcomes Lab in Oxford for hosting this great event. Briefly, I guess, on me, my background is in development and impact investing, having previously worked at CDC Group and Bridges Fund Management, where actually I also worked on structuring payment mechanisms for social impact bonds. I'm actually going to give you quite a macro view today of the whole space rather than talk specifically around how data helps my organization, because it was out of Bridges Fund Management, where I was working in impact investing, that we launched an initiative called the Impact Management Project back in 2016. We launched the Impact Management Project to solve a very particular problem that we were seeing in the market. And that was that all types of organizations, from policymakers to investors to companies to social enterprises, were starting to put together impact frameworks, measurement frameworks, results frameworks, evaluation frameworks. And yet we seem to be competing on the complexity of the frameworks rather than the impact performance for the planet and for the world. And that wasn't due to lack of intent, good intent, but it was because there were no consistent ways of measuring our impacts as organizations on society, the environment, and the economy. And more than that, as I alluded to just there, we were all using such different language to try and explain the type of impact we wanted to achieve. And so the IMP was launched as a consensus building forum. We brought together over 2,000 practitioners from across the value chain to agree effectively on the data needed to understand social, environmental, and economic impacts on people and the planet. We purposefully sought to find consensus across different fields. So from the ESG and impact investing world to corporate sustainability, to the nonprofit and policymaking worlds, to try and bridge those different conversations, but also to find those pockets of expertise that lie there that people weren't benefiting from. As you can see on this slide, the IMP is a public good initiative, and we are funded and advised by all of those organizations there, largely from philanthropy, but we also have the voices of the capital markets in there to effectively give us feedback on whether we're delivering change that's going to help them allocate money for good. Next slide, please. So during this consensus building phase that I mentioned from 2016 to 18, the IMP facilitated consensus on a number of topics that were causing confusion for practitioners. We started simply by defining the word impact. We found that if an outcome is an aspect of well-being, such as good health or education, which is the OECD definition, then impact was perhaps the change in that outcome caused by that organization. And then interestingly, if you break that definition down, you need these 5 categories of data shown here. I won't go into detail, but there's more on this on our website. Just want to give you a sense of this consensus work. Next slide, please. We also sought to address the proliferation of different labels that were appearing, particularly hindering comparison and benchmarking for investors, such as ethical investing, best-in-class ESG, responsible investing, which again weren't really helping folks understand what outcomes they were investing towards. And we found that it was possible to classify organizations by their data-driven impact performance rather than financial attributes or intentions. And that if everybody was doing that in the same way, decision-making would be far easier. Next slide, please. So today, the IMP actually has 3 parts to its strategy. At the top box there, we continue to build consensus with our practitioner community of 2,000, 3,000 now organizations through our online hub called Managing Impact. This is actually launched on the Harvard Business Review Idea Lab platform. It's open for anyone to join, and I would really encourage you all to join the ongoing technical debates we have there. But we actually spend most of our time now facilitating a collaboration of 16 organizations who are coordinating their public good standards to make impact measurement and management practice easier and more joined up. And that's the work that I'm largely going to be talking about with you all today. And then just so you know, at the bottom there, we also incubate an initiative called Impact Frontiers, which works with leading investors to develop impact assessment frameworks and public good training materials, and does that in a very collaborative and also open source way. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to pop this up here because I'm going to be probably talking about a lot of organizations and a lot of acronyms today. So I wanted to give you a chance to look at them all and identify those that you don't know. But these are the organizations that we're working with. And I guess I want to leave you with a thought that we feel working with these organizations now, that it's not widely realized that there are many public good standards that exist to help organizations and investors put in place processes, choose metrics, and benchmark their performance. But we also recognize it's not quite easy enough as it should be yet for practitioners to find the standards they need and figure out what should be used when. So really this group of organizations have come together and shown extraordinary leadership to agree to be facilitated by us to clarify and harmonize this process and landscape over the coming year, in the hope that we can really build an accounting system for sustainability and impact performance that all organizations can ultimately adopt and that regulators can get behind. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of what the IMP is up to, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks again, Olivia. I think interesting to hear about the sort of energy behind this kinds of translational and consensus building work, and indeed how many different languages you have to speak to find that common ground. Thank you for that. So now I will pass things over to you, Sarah. Your go, same question.
Hi.
To you.
I'll start by introducing myself because I've probably brought about 3 hats with me today. As mentioned at the introduction, I'm currently the Director of Methods, Data and Research at the Office for National Statistics. We're obviously very busy at the moment. Hopefully you're hearing about quite a lot of our outputs now, including the work that we're doing on COVID, for example, the infection survey, but lots of other analysis, particularly economic and social as well. But before I joined ONS, I used to work for Manchester City Council. And there I led on 2 things that I think are relevant for our conversation today. The first was we were the commissioner of one of the first 2 social impact bonds that weren't underpinned by government support. So we implemented an intervention that helped young people who were very expensive to the care system to go and live with specialist foster carers, but it enabled us to take them out of residential care and really help them improve their outcomes. That was very much a data-driven exercise, and the data here was about outcomes for children. Obviously, kind of as Gail talked about, amen to everything I mentioned earlier, by the way, but also the financial side of it. So kind of understanding the how the money flows is really important. The other thing that I think is quite relevant to our discussion today was that I led the analysis that underpinned the devolution deal in Greater Manchester. In that respect, we had a number of work streams on different policy areas, and to cut a very long story short, it was really basically about making sure that we accept the funding from government and deliver improved outcomes, but don't set ourselves up to fail. And that has everything to do with the link between outcomes and funding, and knowing that we're measuring the right thing. We're going back to the Office for National Statistics and what we're doing today. Our vision includes data. Data is our raw material, and we generate some of it through surveys, for example. You'll know many of our surveys. Hopefully in a few months' time you'll participate in the census, for example. That's one of our biggest exercises, but we run hundreds of other surveys as well. Some of them are statutory. For example, some of our business surveys are statutory, so that we can collate the statistics that inform decisions, both in the economy and the social, and now in obviously health as well. Over the past few years, we've included in that data that we don't necessarily generate ourselves, predominantly administrative data from government, and we're trying to understand what can we do with that data that would release the burden from participating in data collection exercises such as surveys. So our vision is about data from multiple sources and understanding how they knit together, how they present a coherent picture, and how they help decision making. I'll summarize by saying, though, that I've been an analyst all my life, and I never recall a decision maker asking me to describe the past. They always want to know about the future. And you'll know now that we're all living a very different life because of modeling the future necessarily, not just about describing the past. How we do that well, the ethics around that, what algorithms these feed into, what impacts decisions, so to speak, made from algorithms have on individuals. again, that's something that that everybody's heard about even over the past few days. And for me, that's absolutely critical as part of our vision going forward, really improving lives, but understanding how the data informs that.
Thank you for that, Sarah. So many helpful hacks to have with you today as we sort of talk through a number of these sticky subjects. I will now pass things over to Patty. Tell us about yourself and the CDC and sort of how data is being used for good and how it addresses some of your organizational problems.
Thanks, Claire, and hello, everybody. So my name is Paddy Carter. My job title is the Director of Research and Policy, which really means I'm a bit like an in-house economist at CDC. CDC is the British Development Finance Institution. It is funded from the foreign aid budget. It's not a bank. We're more like a revolving pot of money. We invest only in Africa and South Asia. The vocabulary people use to describe these things changes faster than I can keep up with, but I would, for sake of simplicity, I would say our job is to eradicate poverty and protect the planet. We invest debt, we invest equity, we invest directly, we invest via intermediaries and fund managers. So we do a huge variety of things, which makes our impact management needs and data requirements very complicated. This slide you can see at the moment is a bit of the kind of the world we swim in, and all the pieces that we have to pull together, articulating what we're trying to do, how we make sense of it, how we go about it, and how we measure it. So the Impact Management Project is a very important organization to us. I'm going to go very quickly through the next slides because they're a bit more detailed than are really called for now. So this is what we've done with the Impact Management Project's impact framework. It's extremely simple, it's extremely high level. These are basically are questions that we would ask of every investment that we make. And if you're familiar with the sort of standard impact management project framework, you will not recognize that central column, how. That is something that we inserted, and we inserted that because unlike many impact investors, where if you are, I don't know, selling clean cook stoves, it's quite easy to understand how clean cook stoves have a positive impact on the people who use them. We are often making big investments in what you might think of as the infrastructure of the economy, not literally infrastructure, also things like credit and the financial sector. And that means that we have sometimes indirect and complicated routes to impact. And so we really need to maybe make more effort than some impact investors to understand those more long run and complicated paths to impact. So next slide, please. This is just to show how we sort of carve things up internally. And so the first question we ask ourselves is, what is the impact of this investment going to be? So it's what is this investment that we are participating in going to add to the business that we are investing in? And I mean, if it was a green field that we were starting from scratch, there wouldn't be any little orange boxes there. There'd just be the pink one. But quite often we are investing in an already existing business. And on the right, that you can see those symbols. That's how we sort of organize our analysis of impact using the Impact Management Projects framework. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is an example of us doing that. So this is a summary sheet, and in the background there'd be prose and data and graphs and analysis, but this is what it kind of comes out in a summary, and this is us trying to put in on one page the most salient pieces of information to inform an investment decision. And I think, I'm going to say this later, that what we're really looking at here is we're looking at a data-informed subjective decision. There is a, I'm skipping ahead a bit, but conceptually you might think of a go, no go decision, but it should be based on some sort of impact per dollar hurdle, some sort of minimum amount of impact that you want to see for your money. There's no objective way of answering that question. So you have to make a subjective decision, but you want that subjective decision to be informed by data. And the word data makes me think of observations that you collect but maybe information would be a better word, because we will also be thinking, well, what is this business planning to do? How many of these, whatever it is, do we think it's going to build? So that's not data as such, but it's information which might be a subtly different idea. Next slide, please. So because we are a public development finance institution and we exist to intervene in private markets, we are required to add something to those markets. We can't just substitute for things that private investors would have been doing anyway. So this is the sort of crowding out additionality piece. And so we also have to understand, so this is another layer of complexity. We also have to understand not just what is the impact of that investment, but what's different because of our involvement. This is the sort of the counterfactual thing. And the point I want to bring out here is you can't see this in the data. There's nothing that you can collect from the company after you have invested in it, which is going to tell you how things would have looked if you hadn't invested in it and maybe somebody else had and had done something quite different with it. So, I mean, I think this is a little bit of a caution about the limitations of data, because actually this is the most fundamental question. What is the difference you're making in the world? And yet it's not something that you can put your arms around very easily in a sort of quantitative sense. Next slide, please. Maybe I should stop here. Well, no, I'll quickly run through these and then we'll see if they lead to something in the conversation. So I've already said the thing about the hurdle rate being not something that you can really objectively measure. I want to emphasize that go, no go decisions are really only half of what we're thinking about. What we really want to do is we want to understand the impact of the investment so we can do something about it and work with the investee to raise its impact. There's a lot of talk about data, but it's measuring impact is more like valuing things than it is counting things. The very simple example is that raising the income of someone who's extremely poor by a certain amount is more important than raising the impact by the same amount of someone who's already better off. But how much more? If you're making capital allocation decisions and you're trying to say, well, where should I put my money? You've got to have some sense of sort of relative magnitude. This is the really big problem for impact investors, as far as I'm concerned. And another bit of a caution about data is that we know that what we're really trying to do is make a difference, and that is outcomes minus some sort of counterfactual. But what you collect from a business is often just a sort of more like an outcome piece of information. And there's a risk here because you get all this data and you start plotting it on scatter plots and you start doing all this analysis. And if you're not careful, you make the following sort of mistake, which is that I've put an example here. You define what a decent job is. You start to count where you think that you are creating decent jobs. You observe maybe that you're getting more decent jobs for your dollars of investment in a middle income country. And you think, well, maybe I should start allocating more money into these middle income countries. But you might be missing the fact that a decent job is more impactful, it's more important, it's more valuable in a low income country than it is in a middle income country. And if you don't always think that you've got to weight everything you observe by some sort of sense of importance or value, then you risk kind of sending your organization in the wrong direction. And another problem that we face is it's going back to these indirect paths to impact that I mentioned at the beginning. If you think of the tremendous decrease in poverty that China experienced over the last few decades, which was at a first level of simplification really the result of a sustained investment boom in that country. You kind of know that one thing caused the other, but if you asked an individual investment to measure or capture its contribution to that process, that would be a terrifically difficult thing to do. So we often have to invoke models or estimates, or we have to sort of embed output data in a theory of change and infer impact. Quite often we are not in a position to observe the ultimate impact that we are attempting to bring about in the world. So that's another problem that we have in the use of data internally. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
That was really helpful. And I think it was great to really get a sort of detailed sense from everybody about what your orientation is to this kind of problem, both professionally and via your organization. And so in moving into our sort of next area of questions around sort of more detail on these efforts to drive a data-driven data-driven future. I would like to actually pick up, Olivia, with you. You'd mentioned this facilitation work that you're quite busy with in the IMP, and I would just like to have a better sense of kind of what that looks like. So how is it that you are facilitating conversations? How do you bring people together, and what's the tone of the conversation when it's happening?
Thank you, sure, yeah. So really, as I mentioned, this came from practitioners coming to us, a bit like Paddy actually, and saying, hey, look, we're using these 5 dimensions. We're starting to think about what data we need, but that's not solving all of our problems. You know, we need to know, for example, as a private equity fund or as a fund of funds, exactly what processes we need to put in place. As Paddy said, we need to know how to value different impacts for decision making. You know, do we invest in this industry in this country or this industry in this country? And it's very hard to compare when you don't have the same unit. So you need methodologies for making things the same unit. And then of course you need tools for decision making at different levels, as Paddy alluded to. And so really what we are trying to do is help get to that accounting system, which means get organizations together who have a piece of that puzzle. And that means organizations like GRI and SASB who have metrics that are evidenced, particularly output metrics that are evidenced indicators of the potential outcomes, as well as process standards. So like the UNDP has recently put out some process standards which say exactly what processes you need to put in place to get to a system that will help you. And really these conversations are just iterative over time. You know, can we agree on these definitions? How do you think about this topic? How do you think about this topic? And can we get to a place where there is enough agreement that we can have a system of standards that is global and is applicable for all organizations? And the reason that we think that's important is that that's really how financial accounting started. There used to be lots of different types of financial accounting methodologies as well, until someone turned around and said, hey, you know, this is really confusing because we can't compare results from different organizations. And it feels like that's the place that we're in now. But I did want to emphasize though that, you know, that's not going to necessarily be the silver bullet. I think it's important almost for us to remember our roots as well. And we were called the Impact Management Project because we were reacting to what we were seeing in the space, which was that there was a ton of data being put on impact reports and saying, look, we created some jobs, or we've changed some lives, or we've touched some lives. But there was no context there. There was no context saying, well, whose lives and how much? And what did you expect to happen in the first place? But even more importantly than that, what did you do about it? What change happened? And I think this is where SIBs are really interesting, because I think for the first time, really in the investment space, there was pressure to say, look, the money is predicated on this indicator being right and have no perverse incentives. And that's a really rare thing for investors to have to be held to. You know, they're used to being held to financial metrics, and they decide carry. And those are simple because they're a simple measure. When actually you think about the same for impact, it's always multidimensional, and every organization always has positive or negative impacts. And so it's not quite simple. And so I guess I finish on just saying that I think despite trying to set up a system for accounting, it's really important that we remember that the data has to be useful. You know, just collecting more of it is not the answer. Just being able to compare it is not the answer, but really thinking about what is the level of data required for my decision, regardless of where I am in the value chain, is super important.
Yeah, I think you've said that to me before as enough precision for the decision, if I quote you correctly. Yeah. I think I want to pick up some of the points you've just raised, Olivia, and actually come over to you, Sarah, because in your introduction, you were talking about the work of ONS around sort of maybe democratizing data a bit more, making it more accessible to a wider array of audiences, so that there can be more opportunities for folks to really try to unpick and understand the details of their local context, and indeed take away some of the burden that is often associated with sort of primary data collection. So I'm just curious to know a bit more about what those efforts is and how you think about them in this sort of standardization versus access and democratization kind of approach to things.
Okay, thank you. So I think in some respects, I agree with everything Olivia is saying, but I have another dimension which I think is a little bit more of a challenge to that, which relates to this secondary use of data. So when you are the primary user of data, and that often does happen when you're the sole owner of it, and you can kind of imagine that maybe more in the context of business maybe. When that's in your full control, then obviously that precision is fantastic. However, when you want to start looking at data for other purposes as well, some that you didn't necessarily envisage in advance, you almost missed an opportunity if you didn't capture that data in the first place. And in the world where it's cheaper to collect more data, and in a world where we're developing all sorts of safeguards to make sure that we can still preserve privacy, protect people's privacy, and still benefit from additional analysis, all due to the fact that, you know, we've got more computing power and we can link data together, and we can capture data that we couldn't in the past. If you can do all of that, then potentially you get more insight. And I think that it creates a situation where you can actually learn something that you might not have thought of before if you essentially mine data. Another example that I can give, actually, which is nowhere near as science fiction as what I just described, a good example would be from some of the work that I did in Manchester on devolution. So we implemented a work stream called Working Well, which was essentially implementing the work programme plus a few bells and whistles for our local economy, instead of the DWP programme that was implemented nationwide. Again, going back to what I kind of said earlier, the idea is that we accept the funding and the responsibility, implement something that we believe would deliver better outcomes. And the challenge to us is make sure that we do that, and also that we prove it. And proving it is obviously through the data. So you don't often in life get a chance to start with a complete virgin project, but I did in this case. It was brilliant, and quite unusually, the first thing we did was implement. The first thing we did was commission an evaluation partner, and we made sure when we went out to commission for the practitioners themselves that we are prepared to pay for collection of a lot of data that we might not have asked for if it was just a byproduct of their operations. And the purpose for that was to create a learning environment, and our practitioners became partners in that environment. So the data was obviously analysed and shared with them as well. And one of the insights that we got out of that, which was very, very surprising to us, was that we were able to compare in a statistically reliable way between people who were participating in our programme and people who were not participating in our programme, and demonstrate that the impact of bereavement for quite a substantial cohort really impacted their ability to go back to work, essentially, and often they would be out of work too long, and it would be difficult for them to go back in again. So that subset of the cohort that is totally ignored by many other programs was ignored because it was something that wasn't measured, wasn't captured, and essentially was, I mean, we stumbled on it by mistake. and therefore we were able to kind of implement another support system, which was actually very successful. So that's kind of a clean example of the fact that you, as you analyze data, you do discover things that are interesting, and you need to kind of think of that in advance as well, and leave a bit of wiggle room, I suppose, to enable that.
I think that's a helpful point as well. I just want to underscore the idea as well of the understanding that the additional data capture requirements requires discrete resources, right? This isn't just about adding more stuff to an existing staff, but indeed perhaps thinking about resourcing it as its own, basically its own stream of activity. And thinking too, perhaps around some of these different efforts and challenges, I actually want to turn to you, Patty. I know we've talked about how difficult it has been perhaps to bake in the sort of development impact assessments alongside financial impact assessments in a decision-making process towards investment in the CDC. And so I'm curious if you can kind of, by way of background, share a bit about the process of making those investment decisions, and then give us a sense of how and where development impact assessments do or don't fit in that process for you all.
Claire, I'm not confident I understand the question. Is this about when you might be trying to kind of maybe trade off financial returns against impact, maybe accepting lower financial returns for the sake of, okay. So this is a really super complicated question, because there's another layer of complexity, which is that if we accept, if we price in a way where we're expecting lower returns, or like the required returns that we are kind of negotiating are lower, that is a subsidy. It means that we risk crowding out more because people are going to come to us and say they want that money, and it makes everything a lot more complicated. And sometimes you actually want to price at market to stop that happening, and to make sure that the business that you are investing in is showing other investors that yes, there is a commercially viable business here. So sometimes kind of like in a way, making more money, pricing at market is part of the complicated picture of what you're trying to, and how you're trying to achieve impact. So it's kind of not the case that you that there's like just a simple make less money, have more impact sort of frontier that we are choosing to locate our investments on. Having said that, we do have a balance sheet in two segments, and one segment is called Catalyst, and that segment is for investments that our main book, our growth portfolio, wouldn't normally agree to do, and that's often where there's simply less information. It's something more pioneering. The risks look higher. And actually, when it comes to financial performance, we might, it's not obvious that we make less money in our Catalyst portfolio than we do in the portfolio where we're trying to make more money. But nonetheless, these are when you're looking at investments and you're thinking, normally we'd say no to this, and we do have a sort of dispensation from our shareholder to make less money in this segment of our balance sheet for the sake of higher development impact. And that means that we have to have some way of articulating a higher development impact. We have to say, what is this kind of enhanced development impact bar that an investment has to get above to qualify for this part of our balance sheet. And quite often there we are looking for spillovers. We're looking for some investment beyond the investee. So rather than just thinking, well, this is a business, what is that business going to do? It's something about, there's this business, but it's going to have knock-on effects, and that's an amplifier. I don't know how to bring that answer back to data. I think that maybe one thing to observe is if you're looking for market level impacts, then that means that you have, well, ideally you would be able to get your hands on market level data. And if you are relying on the business itself as your source of data, you're not going to get it from them, or you probably won't get it from them. So there is an additional overhead that you would need to take into account, which is that somebody somewhere is going to have to pay for the collection and analysis of market level data if you wish to demonstrate that you've had some sort of market level impact.
I think that's a really helpful thing to underscore. And actually using that, I want to turn to you, Gail, to talk through actually, when you are looking to source information to help you better understand a particular problem or a decision that you're trying to make, often that can be passed on to the people that you're partnering with. And so for you as a provider organization, you talked earlier about how you're inundated with different KPIs sort of set on you by different commissioners and funders. And I was just hoping you could unpack that a bit for us. What is that tension like? How do you balance sort of your desire for internal learning with the accountability requirements you have passed down to you?
That's a really good question, Claire. I mean, I think to deliver any outcomes-based program or SIB, the provider in the first instance has got to either be delivering an impact-led organisation or to at least have the ambition to do so. So in order to deliver a SIB or meet the demands of any funder, I guess the important thing is to start with is that that the provider has got the ambition in the first place, but also that there has to be, and I think this has been alluded to quite heavily actually by Paddy and Sarah, there needs to be investment. So many charities don't have the investment, don't have the funding to have a decent MI system. They don't have the funding to fund people to run that. And certainly for us, we did have that ambition and we had invested in those things. So that helped with some of those tensions, but it is a tension. I mean, at any one time, as I said earlier, we can have 20 or 30 funders all with different demands. So it's really important that we've got an MI system that can cope with that, and that we've got staff in place who are skilled enough to analyse that data and input it. But I think partly what's missing from some of this dialogue, not today, but generally, is that data's only as good as the data inputter, actually. So going right back to very real practicalities, and certainly we found that. So quite often we found that some of our excellent frontline staff who can make massive impact with young people, and have not necessarily got the interest or the skill set to spend half of their time inputting data. And we find that. So sometimes there's a real dichotomy between an impactful programme as we see it, because we can see real outcomes as they arise day to day. And actually, sometimes that programme, the data might be quite patchy. Or not to the quality that you might want it to be, because those same data inputters are just not skilled in doing it, or don't really see the value of it, because they prefer to be out and about working with young people on the front line. And that again has got to be resourced, that's again got to be managed, those staff need to be trained, other people behind the scenes need to be able to quality assure that data. So all of those things add in to some of those tensions. I think going back to part of the vision about having a single data set and that being really great, I think there is genuine opportunity. I don't think it's complete pie in the sky for funders to come together to develop core data sets. I know this is a conversation that's happening with charitable foundations around grant giving, for example. So I know that some of the large grant givers in the UK are talking together. How can we develop a single data requirement, a core data requirement, which can have add-ons for particular projects, so that we're not asking small providers in particular different questions all the time, which ultimately is taking them away from doing some of the activity that we want them to do. So I think it's possible that we could get there, but it does mean thinking outside the box and using all our innovative, creative thinking processes collectively.
Thanks for that. I think a really helpful articulation of the differences between frontline service delivery and indeed frontline data collection, and that it's perhaps a bit much to ask one person to do all of those things. I kind of want to bring us now into thinking perhaps more critically or reflexively about the limitations of data-driven approaches. And so this will be our last portion of sort of facilitated conversation within the panel, and then we'll start feeding in some of your chat and questions and things like that, which I've been told is a lively debate. So I look forward to getting to it. And I kind of wanted to start with this point that has been made around attribution and perhaps the importance or focus of attribution. And I actually wanted to take this up with you, Olivia. I'm just curious to see, as an organization whose business is kind of convening people, how have you addressed the attribution question? And is this something we should all be striving for? And I know, for instance, that investors, Patty, you mentioned this as well, have really struggled to articulate their own added values, their own attribution, right? So is it fair that they're asking others to do this? Kind of where are people's thoughts on the topic?
Thank you for asking that question, Claire. We at the IMP think it's a really important one and a really interesting one. I first just wanted to, obviously, given my role, look at the language. So the way we see it, there are actually two different things. There's attribution, which is attributing change happening at a level of the people affected or the planet affected, caused by the organization, to the investor. And then there's the value which the investor can add to the organization. And those are actually important things, because one of those data sets, as it were, leads to decision making, and the other is an accounting issue. And if you think that we're collecting data, as I think Sarah and Gail have presented so clearly, for decision making, to really understand what's going on and to make programmatic decisions to improve the performance of different organizations, then one is critical and one should kind of not have so much emphasis. So attribution, were those 5 jobs created by my $10 million? That doesn't actually lead to decision making. That just helps you account for things across different investors, which should be solvable, given that a lot of these investors talk anyway. But the question of whether investors are adding value in markets is a really important one, because I think if you look at any investor's website right now, there'll be all of this language about our value creation methodology. Like, this is what we add. This is why we're the investor of choice. And that's confusing. And I think there needs to be arguably the same level of kind of holding people to account on what the investors are saying they're going to do, as these poor delivery organizations and organizations have to be held to as well. And so, and what I mean by that really is that, interestingly, through all the conversations we had with investors, there were basically 4 strategies that people employ. They signal to the market to say, hey, we care about impact and we're going to look at it in our processes, in our diligence. We're going to collect some data. They say, hey, we're going to engage with our organizations we invest in to improve impact, or at least to help capacity building, to collect data on impact. They say, hey, we're actually going to invest where other investors aren't, because we think there's an opportunity that others haven't seen. Not to be the investor of last resort and say, we're going to go here because no one else is, and we don't think that that's commercially viable for the organizations, but because there's an opportunity. And then finally, we're going to provide flexible or sub-commercial capital, because we know that only through providing that capital can we deliver specific outcomes for maybe particularly vulnerable cohorts of people. And as Paddy said, it is really, really, really hard to get data on, well, did that particular action lead to that thing? But what I think we can be more accountable on as a community of investors is, what actions did we say we were going to take? What actions did we take? And I'll just give you kind of an extreme version of why this is important, which is that some organizations, some investment organizations provide commercial capital in markets actually where it's not needed. And that's hurting the market because they're not asked to prove why they need to be given sub-commercial capital, which could be crowding out other local capital, especially if it's an investor that's not in the country. And it could actually be harming the profitability of these organizations. And so it's really an accountability question there. That's, what did you say you were going to do? Why do you believe this is going to add value? And what happened? What do you think happened? Let's not attribute numbers at the level of 10 jobs created, but let's try and find out what changed, at least in the organization's mentality about this. And for those of you interested in this topic, we've actually just launched a discussion on the Harvard Business Lab platform that I mentioned about negative investor contribution to really make this point. We all know that the capital markets aren't structured for stakeholders, for everybody. There are a lot of decisions and a lot of structural problems in how they operate that actually hurt people more than help people. And so actually to this point of accountability, we're keen to have a discussion around, let's not only claim value creation, let's try and understand value destruction, how these structures have created inequalities. And I think this year we've seen this more than ever. So I'm really keen for anybody who's has thoughts on that to join this debate.
Thanks for that. I know we've had a number of folks commenting in the chat, and it's something we'll unpick, I think, shortly, which is really how we understand and appreciate some very sensitive power dynamics of the stakeholders at the table, be they the investment community, the charitable sector, or some of our government regulators. But we'll turn to that in a second. One thing I wanted to pick up on is actually a conversation Sarah Gale and I had, where Sarah introduced me to the concept of dark data, which is such an evocative term. But the reason I bring it up is because I think it really articulates well, perhaps, some of the areas where data is likely to let us down. And so I'm hoping Sarah will be up for a bit of a teaching moment, and will talk to us about what dark data is and how she sees it shaping or not shaping public policy, and how it might lead us a bit astray.
Yeah, thanks. So, so the concept, I think, is borrowed from physics, essentially, where there's so much dark matter, and the point really is that everything that doesn't get counted, or everything that you can't articulate in numbers or etc., is basically dark data, and actually that could be the bit that explains anything really. So, again, I'll go back to the reality that we're all living in now. COVID's a really good example of that. We're sort of measuring all these cases that we've got now, and we're seeing all sorts of trends where we think maybe, is it going up, is it going down, is there a second wave, all that kind of thing. But actually, what are we comparing to? At the beginning of the pandemic, we weren't counting enough. For all we know, there was more COVID then than there is now. It's a dark data question. We don't know. Obviously, there are ways to uncover some of the data sometimes if you're lucky. In this particular example, in theory, we could go and do serology tests for the whole of the population, and then we would know. But obviously, that's not a very practical thing to do. So so I love the concept of dark data. I think I recommended the book by David Hand when we spoke last, and it was fresh in my mind because I just read it then. But as I reflect on my career, and as you can see, kind of things I'm working on right now, but also things that I worked on in the past, it's pretty obvious that this whole problem of stuff we don't know it is a big one, because we could be attributing the wrong things, and we could be rewarding the wrong behavior, and we could be rewarding the wrong investors. So obviously the more data you have, the more you can overcome that, but I think there will always be quite a lot of dark data around.
Thanks for that. And I know, Gail, you brought up a similar point, which is around this sort of false narrative and the concept that people move linearly from point A to point B. and how perhaps the ways that we're measuring success, particularly in impact bonds, but I think this goes across a number of different kinds of kind of performance indicators, irrespective of the structure of the project, about what success looks like. I was hoping you might want to say a bit about that and how you think about some of the biases that we have when we define success for social projects.
Yeah, so the outcomes programs that we've delivered, including our social impact bonds, assumes that behaviour change starts at one point and finishes at another point. And the starting point, and it's aligned to outcome payments. So the low level outcome payments in terms of finance are soft outcomes. And the big ticket outcomes were with most finance, the hard outcomes. And there's an assumption that people move from A to B in a linear way. And of course, we know that isn't how any of us operate in reality. And certainly we see that when we're working with disadvantaged and vulnerable young people, in the same way that anybody changes, has behaviour change, we see 2 steps forward, 1 step back, dipping out of the programme, coming back in the programme, life happening to them, and then maybe achieving an outcome that's right at the end, and they've actually skipped all the stages in between. And how can we actually measure this and apply it to our learning in terms of understanding and collating data, and understanding how it works and how we can make it work for us. It seems to me that so far there are no examples, I might be wrong, where we're doing any of this, that ultimately we are assuming a progression rate that is at the same rate month per month, and it goes upwards on a gradual scale. I don't know the answers though at this moment. I'd be interested to see what anyone in the chat thinks about that.
Thanks for that, Gail. I think really helpful to really think and interrogate the veracity of these linear models that we have, and indeed assess whether or not they are capturing the many complexities, and I think, as Patty put it, complex pathways to impact. So that is actually going to bring to a close our sort of more formal facilitated discussion. What I would like to do before we move into fielding some of the questions from the chat is invite my colleague Rory to kind of come on the line and offer a couple of comments and reflections from the conversation so far, and maybe kick us off with a question or two. Rory has been working hard on the Indigo project here at the Go Lab, which is a sort of data standardization and use package of materials. So I thought he might be a good person to reflect on some of what we've heard today before we open it up to chat and questions otherwise. So Rory, if you're on the line, I hope you are, over to you. Do we have a Rory? I see him. He's messaging me that he is here. He's muted. Let's see if we can fix that.
Hello.
Hello.
Good, you can hear me. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to pop in, everyone. I'm here to plug really the session that we were having at 3 o'clock about our international network for data on impact and government outcomes, which is Indigo, and it's building and contributing to and playing our part, I think, in a lot of the issues that have been discussed. And so welcome your comments very much, and look forward to your comments in the future as you help us improve. I wanted to suggest that there's power in data if data is for decision making, and I wanted to suggest that we think about this power and note that we're talking about cross-sector partnerships. which have sort of different types of partners. And so somehow they've got different aspects of that power. And I think it's interesting to think about how data is shared within those projects. But I would also suggest that it's important to think about the extent to which data can be shared with the public and how to do that well. And by public, I'm not talking about, well, I'll tell you what I am talking about. When I think about the public, I'm also thinking about new projects. I'm thinking about policymakers around the world who aren't part of that project itself, but are maybe thinking about how to solve similar problems. And so it's the new projects and the people that might be able to learn from data that I'm really thinking about when I talk about the public. And so I wanted to ask the group, to what extent they're thinking about that public, and they're thinking about how they can support the use of data by new projects and the public. And I also really appreciated Gail's comment about the importance of service users or beneficiaries being involved in this sort of initiative. So I would really like to hear more about perhaps examples where people have seen that done well. Thank you.
So can I suggest, Sarah, maybe you can talk a bit about the sort of public disclosure element of data, and if other folks have comments, and then maybe Gail, over to you in terms of some of the service user integration. But of course, Patty and Olivia, if you've got something, throw up your hand and I'll pull you in here. So Sarah, can we start with you?
Okay, so I think there is ambition in the public sector in general, but specifically in government, to make as much data available as possible. But obviously, data is very disclosive, and it becomes even more disclosive when you've got enough computing power to match quite a lot of data together. So I'll use this opportunity to plug a little bit the Secure Research Service, which is something that ONS runs, and it's essentially a platform that's governed by 5 safes. So we make sure that people are trained to use it, that they can only access de-identified data that is relevant to their approved project. We test their outputs to make sure that they're not disclosive, and essentially try and open as much data as we can that way. So there's quite a few ONS surveys, and I think we assessed once that ONS itself can only use about 20% of the data, so can produce analysis from about a 20% capacity. And actually, when we open data to other researchers, you can gain so much more out of it. And the philosophy here is that this is money that this is data that was essentially generated by money from the taxpayer, so the taxpayer should benefit more from it. You can bring your own data into this service as well, and then we can match it for you to other data that we might hold, or somebody else might hold if they agree. So it's not simple, but there's definitely a lot of effort being put into maximizing democratization of data, but at the same time being very, very careful with it, and making sure that we retain trust of the citizen, because it is data about them. Privacy is paramount.
Thanks for that, Sarah. Gail, yeah, can you talk a bit maybe about the inclusion of service users and service users sort of considerations when it comes to actually capturing both maybe process and impacts of services?
Yeah, so in our own organisation, we involve service users at when we're putting a bid together, actually. So if we're putting a bid together for a contract or a grant, we would always involve service users from the beginning. So we would want to know their views on what works, right to what name shall we call the project. So our projects, recent ones have been Project 0114, Apollo project, Amber project. They all those names have actually come from young people, young service users, because it's meaningful to them. And at the same time, they will input into what they think the programme needs to look like. So as a provider, and this isn't unique to charities, lots and lots of charities do serious user engagement through everything they do. I think when it comes to the other way around, I don't think we've ever had any experience ever. There's one which I'll come on to in a second that's been the nearest to it, where commissioners have expected us to involve service users and to build that in, the service user participation, and to build that into the programme right from the beginning. I don't think that is something that's on the radar of commissioners in general. I think that's, as I said earlier, I think that's a real gap. And I think to involve service users from the beginning, it's a no-brainer. You're going to get some significantly improved outcomes if you involve service users from the beginning. The closest we've come in answer to Rory's question, I think, is when we led on the City Region Talent Match programme, which was a big lottery funded programme, which took very much test and learn approach, and there was a huge emphasis on young people's voice, service users' voice. The programme specifically was working with 18 to 25-year-olds who were the furthest away from the labour market and had been out of work or any form of education, training or employment for at least a year, and all came from vulnerable groups. And the theory, which we absolutely embraced, as did the other 20 talent match partnerships around the country, was that we needed to work with those young people to really absolutely understand what were their barriers to access an education and training and employment, and how could we tackle those barriers. So it was a really refreshing experience to have a funder that completely embraced that approach and in fact led it. And I think there's a lot of learning from that for other funders moving forward. It's easy to do. It can be built in from the beginning.
Thanks for that. I'm also seeing a number of different examples of service user integration in the chat, so do kind of follow that conversation. I also know that we've had a lot of back and forth, as I mentioned, on the power dynamics in some of these projects. And I was hoping, I know Elle has been able to follow this a bit more closely than I have. Elle, if you might come on the line and sort of articulate what you're hearing from that chat, and maybe we can sort of put that to some of our panelists.
Thanks, Claire. There's certainly lively discussion in the chat, particularly around power. Interesting comments on impact bonds in particular, and the different dynamics around data systems, whether they're for control or for innovation. That's a poignant point from Mildred. Are these data systems really enabling innovation and change? And how does that relate to the power question?
Yeah, so maybe Olivia, if you could kind of respond to that. And then Patty, I think it might also be great to hear from you in terms of how you think about your own role as an investor in some of your projects.
Sure, I'm not sure I can comment on the SIB example in particular, as I haven't worked on them for 4 years, and I'm sure it's moved a lot since I was working in them. But I think the power dynamic is a really important consideration. I like to think of more as a partnership, and actually I would just like to just amplify what has just been said. I think, the best investors are the ones who think about what the organization needs to run and what the organization needs to measure for their own decision making. I was really struck by, I think it was Gail's point on the different demands of funders being a massive issue for service providers. And I guess it was that in particular that caused us to think about, okay, well, could there be one set of organizational guidance for what information you might need to collect based on materiality, which is, what are the material impacts my organization are having? For who, to Sarah's great point, we always need to know who, and actually that's an area that is often missed out. So that should be sufficient for all funders. They're wanting to know about the impacts, they're wanting to know about the positive and the negative. I think we need to do some more work on negative as a whole, because I think we always just see the positive. But if that was produced to funders, then that should be sufficient for their own decision making too. And I think that levels out the power dynamic. And then I think, just to echo that point as well on feedback being at the heart of this, I think one of the big excuses we hear from lots of investors is, oh, well, we can't get the data, can't collect outcomes data. We don't want to have to pay for measurement. That needs to change too, I think, which is to say that if you look hard enough, there are a lot of good outcome measures out there. And I know this is going to be something discussed elsewhere in the conference, but also good feedback, good surveying of service users, customers, whatever you want to call them, is at the heart of really understand what's going on. And it doesn't have to be expensive. And actually that's a big role that investors can play in adding capacity and you know, churning through that data on behalf of the organization. So I think, you know, I think this is why this conversation on negative investor contribution is so important, because I do think we need to equip organizations to know what to look for when they're looking for investors and funders, and to have more of a choice. You know, it shouldn't just be that we're running pillar to post. So apologies for not talking about SIB specifically, but I hope that's helpful.
I think still very helpful. Patty, did you have anything you might add to that?
Yeah, so again, on the theme of power, so first of all, obviously, as an investor, your influence varies from instrument to instrument, ranging from all the way from we own 100% of the equity in this company and completely in control of it, to we are one lender in a debt syndicate that probably don't even know our name, you know. But then again, you can be in a situation where on paper you might not think you have much power, but you send your ESG team in, they get a good relationship with the management, they get excited about something they want to do together, and then suddenly away you go. You're doing something terrifically impactful and exciting, and it hasn't come because you kind of formally have any levers over them through your financial relationship. And it might be natural to think that the investor kind of holds the whip hand, and there are certainly points in time when the power is on the side of the investor, but then that doesn't last, and suddenly, you know, you're kind of, Olivia was saying, you know, you hear people complaining that they can't get data out of businesses. That's a real problem. We can't get data out of businesses because we can't make them do things that they don't want to do. And we, you know, the only options to us, you know, we're not going to place someone in default or, you know, sell our equity at a loss and walk away. That's a nuclear button. We don't press it very, well, we wouldn't press it just because they're being a bit slow at giving us some data. So it's all about mutual interest. I mean, it has to be, you know, to get the more interesting data, particularly, let's say you might think that what we really want to do to get at this difference we're making to people's lives, we want to conduct surveys of the workforce of the business. And there, you know, you've got to find a way of saying to convincing management that this is in your interest too. You know, you can get something that you can use out of this, and we'll get something that we can use out of this, and then they're going to be prepared to allow you to survey their workforce. So that's like a kind of negotiation. No, I've run out. I've just lost my train of thought. But anyway, maybe that's enough on power and data.
I think a helpful understanding perhaps of what it feels like from the investor standpoint in terms of the levers that you might have at your disposal, understanding, of course, that that's largely going to depend on the kind of investor that you are and the tools that you use. I'm aware that we are at time, which is disappointing because there's so many good questions coming in via chat and so much ground left unturned. But I just wanted to thank everybody now for having a vibrant conversation with us. I think we stretched our brains satisfactorily, for sure. You know, really trying to understand the importance of resourcing, data capture, really trying to be clear about why we're collecting data and tying it to decisions, and really making sure that, you know, we don't have a false sense of what data is actually able to accomplish for us and our organizations. So again, thank you, and especially thank you to our panelists for a really stimulating chat. So what's next? At this point in the conference program, you have the option of staying on the line for some small informal breakout sessions, or you might need to take a short break, in which case all of our formal sessions will kick back off at 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m., you can choose from joining a deep dive on contracting for risk transfer and innovation, or you can attend the peer learning group that Rory mentioned for Indigo, the International Network for Data on Impact and Government Outcomes. And you can find links to either session in your online program. So again, stay on the line and you'll be pulled through space and time to join a breakout room where you can chat a bit more informally to other conference attendees, or indeed come back and join us at 3 p.m. In the parallel session of your choice. So thanks so much for joining us.